White people have never understood trans people, and they keep proving it. For centuries, white societies have failed to comprehend, respect, or even acknowledge trans identities, while simultaneously imposing their own rigid, non-binary gender norms on the rest of the world. They erased and criminalized trans and non-binary identities in their own cultures. They colonized societies that had well-established trans traditions and called them primitive or sinful. They medicalized and pathologized trans people, treating gender variance as a mental illness. They only started caring about trans issues when it became a political battleground, but still get everything wrong. At every stage in history, white people have been behind when it comes to understanding gender. White people love to act like trans identities are a new phenomenon, but history shows that gender fluidity existed long before Europeans decided that gender was binary. Indigenous North American cultures had two-spirit identities, a respected role that existed before European colonization. India had Hijras, a third gender community with spiritual and social significance going back thousands of years. The Philippines had the Babaylan, a gender-fluid shaman who held religious authority. West African societies recognized gender variance, with Igbo and Yoruba societies acknowledging gender-diverse roles. Ancient Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome had trans priests and gender-diverse figures, long before Christianity imposed strict gender binaries. White colonialism systematically erased, criminalized, and suppressed these identities. European missionaries forced natives to abandon two-spirit roles. British colonizers criminalized hijras with anti-LGBT laws that are still in place today. African gender variance was violently suppressed under European-imposed Christian morality. White people didn't just misunderstand trans identities, they actively worked to erase them. European Christianity rigidly enforced a two-gender system, not because it was natural, but because it reinforced patriarchal control. Catholicism and other denominations preached that men and women had fixed roles. Any deviation from the binary gender was deemed demonic or sinful. They forced gender conformity to maintain social hierarchy. Women were subjugated and men were dominant. They burned gender non-conforming people as witches or heretics. White Christian societies weren't just clueless about trans people. They were also violently opposed to anyone who didn't fit their rigid structure. And yet, white conservatives today still try to use Christianity to justify transphobia, despite the fact that Jesus never said anything about trans people. And the Bible was written in societies that acknowledged more than two genders. And most Christian gender norms were invented centuries after Jesus lived. White Christianity didn't just misunderstand gender, it turned it into a tool of oppression. Before colonization, many cultures saw trans people as natural parts of society. After colonization, European scientists declared being trans a mental illness. Instead of recognizing gender variance as a normal part of the human experience, white medical systems labeled trans people as disordered or degenerate, invented conversion therapy to fix non-gender conforming people, created pathologizing standards for healthcare, forcing trans people to prove they were trans enough. They imposed European beauty standards on trans people. If you didn't pass as the binary opposite gender, you weren't seen as valid. White medical institutions didn't seek to understand trans identities. They sought to control them. Even today, white-dominated medical systems make it unnecessarily difficult for trans people to access healthcare, gatekeeping gender-affirming treatments behind layers of bureaucracy. White feminists love to act like they invented gender liberation, but historically, they have attacked and excluded trans people at every turn. In the 1970s, second-wave feminists like Janice Raymond and Germaine Greer pushed transphobic rhetoric, claiming trans women were invading women's spaces. White feminist organizations ignored or actively opposed trans rights, prioritizing cisgender women's rights while dismissing trans people as a distraction. Even today, white TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, push anti-trans propaganda, aligning with the far right while pretending to be progressive. Meanwhile, black, indigenous, and non-white feminists have long viewed gender as a complex, fluid system, not a strict binary. Intersectional feminists have always included trans rights in their fight for liberation. Non-white cultures have never separated gender identity from broader social struggles. Black and brown trans activists have led LGBTQ+ movements, while white feminists often gatekeep the conversation. White feminism did not create gender equality. It created a limited, exclusionary version of it that often ignores trans people. White conservatives claim trans people are a new trend. White liberals tokenize trans people, but still fail to fight for real structural change. They act like being trans is a new issue when it's been a part of human history for thousands of years. They claim to defend science, but ignore the fact that science supports trans identities. They legislate against trans people, banning healthcare, sports participation, and public existence, just like they did to non-white gender-diverse cultures under British colonial rule. White people are still trying to control trans identities just like they did under colonialism. They tried to erase trans people from history and then pretend that trans history didn't exist. They criminalized trans identities, and now they pass anti-trans laws under the guise of protecting children. They forced gender conformity in the past, and now they claim to be the protectors of traditional gender roles. White societies have never understood trans people because they have always been about rigid categories, control, and domination. White people don't understand trans people because they refuse to learn. Instead of asking, what have we been wrong about gender this whole time, they double down on the same oppressive structures they've been pushing for centuries. But history doesn't lie. Trans people have always existed, and white people have always been the last to figure it out. Cope.